2 sub, thank you, Fat at Car Latte. Tane with tier 1 sub, thank you. Tyler in .com with the incredibly kind 10 bucks. Made a sim rap for you. Oh, I'll check that out in a bit. Okay, hold on, because we're about to talk to Hakim. Sociable G with the 5 gifted tier 1 subs. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, comrade. Puff with the tier 1 sub. You people are being crazy today with the fucking gifted subs. Oh, looks like Hakim's ready to start. All right, roll up, team. All right.
All right. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yo, I can hear you just fine. What's up?
I can't seem to hear you. Hold on.
Uh-oh. Always something. Why do I feel stressed about this? Why are you people in chat stressed? What is wrong with you people? Can you hear me? Okay, hold on. I can hear you. Well, apparently Hakim can't hear me, so we'll figure out the technical bits in just a second. I'll disconnect and rejoin, I guess. Da-da-da-da-da. Hello?
Yeah, now I can hear you, but there's a bit of an echo, so just one sec. Let me just sort that out.
Gotcha. Is it? Do you have your my stream on as well?
Nah, just Discord is for some reason paralleling to audio sources.
Ooh, cringe. No worries. I'm not going anywhere.
Could you speak, please?
Yeah, what's up?
All right, it went away now. Give me a sec.
Okay, wait. Is there a delay between me speaking and you hearing me? Oh.
All right. Now it's working. Okay.
So you can hear me just fine?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. There doesn't seem to be much of a delay. That's nice. How you doing?
All good. Thank you for having me on. It's not a Discord chat if there aren't at least some technical issues, at least in my experience.
Yeah, of course. It's the aesthetic flourish. It's necessary.
Yeah. So should we? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. There was a bit of a delay. Let's hope that sorts itself out.
Well, you're on the other side of the world. What's the expected delay for folks that are that far away? It's probably like at least a little bit of time, right?
Yeah, but right now it seems okay.
Okay.
It's not too bad.
We'll live with it. All right. What inspired you to talk to me? People usually don't go from making hit piece videos on me to opening up to conversation. Not to say I don't appreciate it. I love talking to people, but what inspired the change?
Sure thing, yeah. Just before we start, just one thing. The volume on mine is all right, I hope.
Yeah, and I can adjust it on my end. You sound good.
All right, perfect. All right, so I guess I'll introduce myself and then answer your question. My name is Hakim. I am a physician by profession, but I make random YouTube videos just, for the fun of it, really. Generally, I make videos on Marxist topics, history related, on, occasionally response videos, stuff like that. So the perspective, I guess, that I had when going into this was I realized that maybe response videos or just like back and forths wouldn't help. Just generally, I didn't want to make it like a drama thing, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to see that, or in my opinion, I think that you and I probably agree on way more than we disagree on. And most of what we disagree on is probably just either misunderstandings on each other's parts or just errors in communication or, things that can be cleared up with a discussion, basically. So I thought, why not actually just reach out? We can have a conversation and I can give you my perspective. You can give me your perspective, of course, like my perspective being an Iraqi Arab, your perspective being a Euro-American person from California, I believe.
Yeah, thereabouts.
Yeah, all right. But yeah, so I guess if there is such a big difference between coastal and Midwest and like opinions, maybe there is. You'd know better than I would. That's the point of the discussion. So we can Like I can get more of your perspective, you can get more of my perspective, and then we can reach kind of like a, not necessarily a middle point, but an understanding of each other that is far less toxic and far more productive than what was occurring before. I hope.
Yeah,
that
not
makes
many
sense.
people are familiar with the nuances of Kropotkinism, Californianism, so I'm happy to share my perspective and experiences. Well, you typed some stuff up you wanted to talk about, but I'll hand the floor to you. I think give us a subject. What do you want to what discourse do you want to engage in? I mean, obviously we have the content of the videos that were made previously. I didn't watch your second video. I think I skimmed through the timestamps. I saw the first one.
Right.
Did you want to rehash those topics, or did you just want to like start with a given subject?
I think it's more productive for our parts because like the videos are there. It's fine. I think we can just set the theory aside and just talk about just like the beliefs or at least understandings.
That's the serious side. Oh, you're going to get canceled, mate. All right.
Man.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I guess then, you know what? I'll just define myself, okay? I used to call myself an anarchist, but I find there's a lot of contention about the specific definitions of anarchists and how much it pertains to strategy rather than like baseline principle. I just call myself a libertarian socialist now, which I find is a more accurate descriptor. I also think it's rhetorically useful because libertarianism is usually associated with capitalism. So to describe myself as a libertarian while being a leftist usually makes it easier if I'm arguing with like a right-leaning person to confuse them, or they say something dumb and I get to correct them. So that's usually fun. And that's generally how I come at things.
All right, fair enough. I'd say that my personal perspective is that of a Marxist-Leninist, but when it comes to the concept, more like the idea of libertarianism, some people might find it a bit funny, but I share your views on that. I personally consider myself a libertarian too. When it comes to the like pragmatism of what we have to do and whatnot, then sometimes the libertarianism of at least on my end, has to be dulled. But the things that I think both of us would like let's say in an ideal world, if we could have a socialist revolution based on democratic participation, bloodless, based on a peaceful acquisition of power on the part of the working class, where everything is just transferred over and there's I don't want to say difficulties, there are always difficulties, but I mean that the ruling classes would give up their power willingly, or at least willingly enough, so that there wouldn't have to be too much force being used. There wouldn't have to be any bloodshed at all. Nobody would have to be dispossessed in any meaningful sense of the word, and everybody's rights would be respected. Not necessarily in the liberal, Enlightenment sense, but more, let's say, in just a human rights sort of sense. That is my personal perspective, and that's what I would love. That's actually my ideal. And would I be correct in assuming that it's the same case for you?
Yeah, I've been practicing up to debate the bourgeois out of control over the means of production in the free marketplace of ideas. I mean, that's the ideal, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the conversation that I want to enter into, and I think this is just a generally interesting topic, is the reform and revolution. Not reform versus revolution, because I think that is an unfair dichotomy to put. I think people who are only for reform are wrong, and I think people who only put emphasis on revolution are equally wrong. I think that there is room for both of these to, depending on the local circumstances and the development of or the state of class consciousness amongst the working class that is present and wherever you are, as well as the readiness of the progressive forces wherever you are. Both are equally, in my opinion, valid options depending on the time and place, and most of the time let's say a timid approach towards both is a safe bet, so to speak, with emphasis on one or the other depending on your current position. Would I be also right in assuming that's your position as well?
Yes. I'm not so idealist as to believe there would ever be a point in time, or at least a likely point in time, where everything that we want done could ever be achieved without some kind of meaningful material conflict. My goal, or at least my hope, would be that we could achieve enough of a gain through reform that we could prompt the powers that be into action against us, in which case any revolutionary action would be retaliatory rather than instigatory, which would give us at least optically, a pretty strong upper hand. I don't think there's much potential, certainly not in America. I mean, this could vary country to country, but in America, the idea of revolutionaries taking to the street and seizing the country is laughable. It's a joke. That's never, ever going to happen. But if things...
And I agree.
Right. And if things move further enough, far enough down the line, and maybe class consciousness spreads and the average working class person in America is a little bit more aware of their material, relationship to power, and we achieve enough, eventually maybe there's some a coup that's attempted, like the business plot back in like 1920s America. And if we, oust that, then we kind of have an excuse or a means by which we could achieve more radical change.
That's a very interesting perspective, and there's an interesting parallel. I don't know if you personally read up on this, but the political approach of Arab nationalists and Arab socialists in the middle of the past century heavily, let's say, echoes what you just said, or you echo what they had done.
No, they learned from me. You were right the first time.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's very interesting to know. Just a minor side note, it is almost midnight here, so my English can like flip every once in a while. So excuse me if like a word just sounds weird or something.
No, I speak to plenty of Americans who speak English worse than you. Don't worry about it.
Thank you very much. That, and also just a second point, just to general chat. My internet will most likely not be able to handle both streaming on Discord and also watching the stream and looking at the chat. So I will not be looking at the chat for now. If you have questions for me, then maybe we can get to them at the end. Otherwise, if you have any just direct questions, feel free to DM me on Twitter whenever. My DMs are always open, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. So with that to the side, I appreciate your perspective, and I understand why you would give it in that way, because I fully agree with you. I think that the concept of revolution, or at least the attempting revolution in any meaningful sense of the word, in the current imperial core, in the current, let's say, metropolitan, right? In the first, as much as I don't like the first, quote unquote, first world countries, yeah, it would be laughable, like you said. That's actually a very apt way of putting it. Because not only are the working classes not really into that idea, maybe it would be opposite to it would contradict their direct interest, at least as of right now. And this is where I would like to kind of bring the discussion. I was hoping that you could give me your personal perspective on the development of, for example, sufficient class consciousness, or basically let's say the general strategy for a first world, highly wealthy nation like the United States, what you consider to be the correct course or order of things that is required to be done in order to reach basically, not necessarily a point of revolution, but at least seizure of state power by the working class, which I assume that is something that you desire as well.
Oh, yeah. I guess my main issue, and this is particular to the United States, there are countries in Europe that aren't this cucked. But in the United States, union culture is dead. Unions are dead. There's just no unions. There are some unionized sectors of our working class, but they're often government workers, or the unions are so normalized and so institutionalized that they aren't even really considered bastions of working class power. So the problem is, at the end of the day, we need more people who are leftists. We need more people who are amicable to the interests of the working class. And there are two main ways to do that. You can either do that through the propagation of these ideas through policy, or through the organization, the natural organization of working class people. Unions would be an example of that. We haven't been succeeding. Unions have been dying for decades. Or through thought leaders. And the most common type of thought leader is politicians. We do have other thought leaders who aren't politically who aren't elected officials, like your Jordan Petersons or your Stephen Crowders, and for some reason they're always Canadians. But the problem is these people tend to come from money, and obviously money doesn't associate with our kind, at least not as readily. So the only avenue we have to really get these big voices out there, I feel, is through political advocacy. And that's the reason why I invest myself in this electoral nonsense. I don't think the Democratic Party is going to achieve much in the way of working class reform. Maybe they're not as bad as Republicans, and I do believe that firmly. But in terms of moving us towards socialism, I don't think that's happening. But in 2015, something magical happened in this country, and that's that public opinion, and there are a million polls to substantiate this, public opinion on socialism, on working class politics, on everything associated with leftist advocacy surged because of Bernie Sanders. And this little known independent senator from Vermont ended up capturing the hearts of tens of millions of Americans. And of course he lost, but to go from an independent senator to the second runner-up behind Hillary Clinton, a DNC frontliner, in one election cycle, that's really, really impressive. And since then, public opinion on socialism and other left-leaning things, they've gone up significantly within the Democratic Party. My goal is not to use the Justice Dems, AOC, Ilhan Omar, whatever, as a means to achieve revolutionary action or even reform, but rather to abuse the soapboxes which come along with public office to advocate for left-leaning politic. And in so doing, we gain the opportunity to effect more meaningful change through the organic organization of working class peoples, through union creation or through like strikes or through other forms of solidarity. But we can only do that if enough people agree with us. And I think that right now is probably the most effective way of going about it. Like, we've had communist parties in this country for like a century, standing on the sidewalk, handing out pamphlets, organizing meet and greets and get-togethers and homeless person resource acquisitions. These are great. They're good work. I'm not, besmirching them. I think it's wonderful what these people do, but they're not moving us any closer towards broad working class consciousness. We need something new. And that's my hope, that we can take advantage of this progressive surge in the Democratic Party.
That's actually very interesting. Yeah. I think I would more or less align with your position. The way I would talk about it, because there's a couple of points mentioned, that being not actual belief in electoralism, leading us to a socialist or at least a working class acquisition of state power, but more to, like you said, use the microphones that these sort of political institutions usually have to put forth a message that will be heard and on and on. That's one point. The other point is the failure of let's say unviability. Yeah, you know what I'm trying to say, of third parties. And the third point was working class organizations of some kind, like community organization. I mentioned this in my second video actually, and it's just something that I want to get your perspective on. Because I assume that yes, you most likely do not. You don't want just the Democrats and that's it. And that's a very correct position to have for them to just kind of play a very small part in an otherwise much larger overarching, let's say, general strategy. But this is my perspective, I think. And as an American, I'm hoping you can comment on it. It's this. The idea of building a caucus, for example, within the Democrats, let's say one that is used to bring working class talking points to the floor, and to at least make these ideas more prevalent in society through use of media and whatnot. That could be one segment of this. But a caucus on its own will always be limited by the very fact that the Democrat Party is itself a capitalist party with, it's a capitalist institution that serves the needs and wants and desires of a particular section of the ruling class of the United States. So when we talk about caucus building, fair enough. Okay, that could be one segment. In my mind, it would make sense to have, this is one part of the puzzle and it's missing two other bits, which I think you also agree with. Those two other bits being, for example, a working class organization of some form. It doesn't have to be a party, although ideally it would be a party. And I'll link this to the third party thing that we mentioned before. But it could be a party, let's say. And then the third aspect of this is working class, basically community organization that is connected to said working class, let's say, party, that does things, let's say, along the forms of what the Black Panthers did. Not exactly 100% just copy paste, but the general, how do you call it? The spirit, that's the way of saying it, the spirit of what they were doing. And this caucus, which can destabilize the system internally, support both working class organizations and parties. Because here's a question for you, because maybe this wasn't entirely clear. Do you personally believe that the Democratic Party, when when Americans try to get it into power and whatnot, the point of doing so is to show that basically the inadequacy of said party for bringing about real change to the population and then bolstering more radical talking points. Do you agree with this generally?
Yes, very much. One of the big issues over the past 4 years is that our country is dying and liberals just blame Trump. And Trump, I mean, to be fair, Trump is a terrible leader, but a lot of the problems we're dealing with are much more institutional. And by giving them Trump as an easy goat to burn, it prevents them, I think, from being more introspective about the nature of these issues.
Fair enough, yeah. So that's a very interesting point to note, because I personally think that I somewhat align on this point. And I would say the idea of the caucus building, let's just take the viability of that on its own. Why not also develop working class organizations, like I mentioned, along with this electoral participation, but along numerous fronts. So not just along just one axis, but numerous axes. So you'd have, like, for example, a working class party, a caucus built up within the Democrats itself, disrupting the system, like I mentioned before, from the inside, and supporting the aims of the working class party, and working class organizations on their own, mutual aid groups and community organization, again, in the spirit of the Black Panthers and whatnot, all supporting each other in turn. So it is a general social movement that isn't left to the, let's say, upper echelons of political participation, but is throughout the whole system. So it's not purely grassroots. It's not purely part of this, establishment politics, but it has its roots in every bit of American society, if that makes sense to you. What would you say about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Black Panther Party was what got me into left politics to begin with. I read the assassination of Frederick Hampton during my freshman year in college, and I was like, it gripped me. Yeah. The issue that I have, so there are 2 points I'd like to make in response to that. The reason why I care so much about the Democrats is twofold. The first of which being, you can put progressives forward in the Democrats. You can't really in the Republicans for a number of reasons. And secondfold, I do think that the Republicans are an existential threat to the future of the country. So I do consider it a virtue on its own just to keep Republicans from staying in office for a number of reasons, like climate change being like a really, really obvious one. The Attorney General Barr was considering like sedition charges against Black Lives Matter protesters. I feel like it would take one or two Republican presidents to like get rid of democracy in this country, or whatever vestige of democracy we pretend to have, at least. So I do care a lot about that. But with regards to like the caucus, the Democratic caucus is very limited in its power. There's very, very, very little they can do because ultimately AOC, let's just take AOC. Her effectiveness is dictated by the extent to which she can get Democrats to believe, the voters, not the politicians, that she represents their interests. But that means every time she takes a step against Pelosi, or every time she takes a step against the rest of the DNC, there's a risk that she's going to end up looking bad in the eyes of the voting population because she looks like an antagonist to the party. Party loyalty runs deep in this country, unfortunately. So caucuses are limited. What I want to see, and this is something that could only happen under a Democratic presidency, and maybe not even then, is the removal of the Electoral College and also first past the post, meaning that third parties could be, for the first time ever, really, viable in this country. If we could get like a functioning Green Party as a third party with a couple of seats in the Senate and in Congress, and they were capable of like swinging the Democratic vote, and they could extract concessions from the DNC, that would be more than we have ever managed to get from this country. And those people could be real leftists, or at the very least, they could be like Bernie Sanders-esque sock dems who like signal socialism every time they open their mouth. That's what I dream of. But none of that should come at the expense of the development of organic working class organizations. I only wish that we had a country capable of allowing people to develop those relations. Unions can't function right now. And with the way our police state works, it'd be really, really, really difficult for like a Black Panther Party-esque thing to rise up again. People aren't willing to risk themselves the way they were back then. It's not the 60s anymore. I think we need something pivotal to change. And my hope is that we can extract something like that. Maybe a policy allowing unionization to be a little more viable, or third parties, and that could allow us to do much more meaningful work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly. I'm actually that's what I was hoping that you would say, because it shows, at least it shows to me that your understanding. I don't want to say it's very European, but because that might have some negative connotations. But the perspective that you have given is interesting because essentially, if this is right, would you personally agree with a parliamentary system because you mentioned getting a first past the post voting, getting it taken away, like replacing it with a system where other parties become viable? Would you agree with a European parliamentary system being developed in the US and that being a viable avenue for development of at least socialist policies, or at least social democrat policies at the very beginning?
Yeah, I think that'd be significantly better. Yeah, I mean, I think getting rid of the Senate and just having a parliamentary house would probably be an unfathomably positive change for how our country operates. Yeah, I don't think we can get rid of the Senate, I don't think we can get rid of the Senate without some pretty significant constitutional reform. But changing first past the post, I think we could do that without amending the Constitution. So maybe it's a more viable, realistic, immediate step. Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Then that actually, yeah, that's very interesting that you say this. Because if you're okay with it, I would give currently I can give my perspective on revolution. Let's say in Iraq,
please.
for example. Yeah, and then I can So I'll do this, and then I'll discuss an interesting point to be made about this. Let's say the viability of third parties being made a thing that can be done in the United States. If that were the case, then what that would mean is that let's say parliamentary system within the United States would allow for European style parties to exist. With European style parties existing, that means you'd have, of course, probably Democrat and Republicans would remain, but you would have a social democratic party, a Green Party, other sorts of, parties having, a proportional representation according to the vote that they get, which is perfectly fine. But the thing is that, in my personal opinion, what this would do is it would improve the living standards of the American people because they would have greater representation, and as a result, they could possibly actually get certain things that have wide support for, like, for example, universal healthcare, which is widely supported by the populations that are actually affected by it, that require it, which is practically the entire American population at this point. But that is something that the American people do generally want that they cannot get with the current two-party system. Another one would be, for example, the debt annulment, the student debt annulment. That's another thing that could genuinely maybe be carried out through a parliamentary system. But at the end of the day, I personally think that even in a parliamentary system, socialism reaching for the working class to seize political power in any meaningful sense of the word would not be possible, even in a parliamentary system. And the perfect example to give would be the European social democracies, which have all but either crumbled or fully retreated, or have just become very set in their ways of, rather than trying to get rid of capitalism they had written in their party programs 100 years ago, now they just want to be administrators of a much kinder, gentler capitalism, if that makes sense. And I personally think that this would also occur in the United States. I just want to know if you agree about this, and then I can talk about the Iraqi concept of revolution.
Oh yeah, for sure. Social democracy is a sinkhole. Now, the European democracies are better than ours. I mean, Norway, Sweden, say what you want about them being co-opted by the capitalist establishment, but America fucking sucks. So I would still, even like if I dropped my dreams of being a socialist, I would still prefer them to what we have now. But yeah, it's important to like recognize the closer you get to administrative control of the state, the harder it is, I think, to like take that last leap. In part, I think, because the living standards for everyone rise to a point where the idea of any kind of revolutionary action seems, well, I mean, it doesn't really seem worthwhile. Usually revolutionaries are people in the desperate or the brink of poverty or destitution or starvation. And we just don't, well, I mean, in America, we kind of have that. But like the Norwegian population is not going to be rising up to do that. My goal would be that we could approach social democracy. And I mean, realistically speaking, I think if socialism's to come from this world, it would probably be coming from the global south. And that our goal, as my goal as an American, would be to make this country as class conscious as possible and to effectively neuter its militaristic and intelligence operations, so that should socialism arise in other countries, the victims of global capitalism, it would be more difficult for us, I mean America, not socialists in America, for America to retaliate or to destroy the fruits of the socialist labor. That would be my goal. We have to make America better. We have to get the population on board with socialism, and we have to keep America from interfering with other countries that can reach out and, and touch the sun.
Perfect. Beautiful. That's beautifully said, because that was what I was hoping to get to. That's the point that I want to reach. Because when it comes to generally social democracy, and when we think about it, even at best, even if we achieve these improvements for working classes in these imperial core countries, the issue still ends up being that social democracy, as good as it may be for the population that is experiencing, usually a European or a European-derived population, like in North America being Canada or the United States, the issue is that social democracy still subsists on the exploitation of the third world. I don't want to use the emotional term exploitation, but what I mean is...
it's totally true. Yeah. All the shiny buildings in Finland, like for every shiny building, we have 3 sweatshops somewhere in
exactly.
Yeah, Thailand.
Bangladesh or exactly. Or the Kenyan tea plantations, exactly. And that's really nice to note, because then it shows. Okay, beautiful. When you have a system, not to just, I'm not going to bring in theory. There's just the one line that's.
I'm not allergic to it. I've read a little. Not hit me.
Yeah. The one line that I would like to bring is the title of Lenin's work, simply. Capitalism, that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting that this particular, when we say that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, what this means is that capitalism has reached a point in its development where it cannot continue to expand without the presence of imperialism. Now, what does this mean concretely? What this means is that in order, the natural progression of capitalism that has occurred first in Europe and then it's extended elsewhere in the world, like into the United States and onwards, is for capitalism is to expand into other markets, right? Not only to expand into other markets, but to develop the export of capital. Now, what happens normally, or what is the trend that has been observed, is that with the development of social democracy in Europe, when I mention about social democracy, by the way, just as a side note, Venezuela and Bolivia are trying to do a form of social democracy, but their, let's say, growth is bolstered or at least supported by the wealth that they generate from their natural resources, right? It's almost a form of primitive accumulation on a national scale that isn't dependent on the exploitation of other populations. This is radically different from what was experienced by the European countries. But with the development of social democracy, what happened was that there became a stratification of working classes in the world. What occurred was that the working classes of, let's say, Bangladesh or Kenya or Peru became on, let's say, one side, and then the working classes of Germany and Sweden and Britain and Canada and the US became on another side. Now, this is not to say like this is a nefarious thing that capitalists try to do. No, this is just a natural progression of capitalism. What started occurring was that there became, or what began is a formation of a labor aristocracy, as Lenin and Marx and Engels termed it. Now, what this labor aristocracy basically means is that the labor of and the value that is produced outside of these imperial core nations was being used to subsidize the living standards of the working classes in the imperial core. This is a concept. This is built upon the concepts of, for example, unequal exchange, the concept of value transference, as it was explained by Samir Amin. The concept as it was developed by Sack Cope, for example, and beautifully shown in his book, Divided World, Divided Class, on and on. Now, what this means is that social democracy, as you have very rightly stated, is a sinkhole. It will not allow this next leap into socialism to occur because it specifically makes it so that a section of the working class, of these imperial core countries have their interests set somewhat along with the bourgeoisie of those countries. Mm-hmm. A small segment of, or not small, but a considerable enough segment, not the whole population. For example, I would not say that the Native American population within the U.S. or the poorest Chicano and Black communities in the U.S. and even the very poor white populations across the Midwest and what have you, the areas are so heavily hit by the opioid epidemic in the United States. I'm not saying that these people would necessarily constitute part of the labor aristocracy. This would require much more research. But generally, when we take a look particularly at skilled labor within these imperial core countries, we see that the very fact that their wages are so high, for example, are based particularly on the value transference from the imperial periphery into the imperial core, which as a result causes the interests of these new working classes to not align with the working classes abroad, like, for example, in Bangladesh, let's say, but instead align more with the continued bourgeois, let's say, encroachment on these other places, the continued development of imperialism, the continued administration of social democratic parties and their, as mentioned before, milder, gentler capitalism.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you.
Exactly.
Even in America today, and America has a lot of poor people, a person working off minimum wage has access to some amenities that a person working in Bangladesh never would have. Not just as a matter of infrastructural development, but like gods, from everything from the wages to what they can expect from their politician. Workers in the West or the global North or whatever are, privileged in some respects. I don't think that doesn't make them part of the proletariat. I think they are. This is one of the reasons why I come down so hard on nationalism, on the right and the left, because I think one of the greatest enemies we have to global socialism is the idea that it's possible to procure such a society with an insular, nationally oriented worldview. It would take cooperation amongst the working class in first and third world nations to bring about anything meaningful. And I think that, well, most leftists are better about that than most non-leftists. There are some leftists, I think, who are very, very nationally oriented. Of course, everyone's going to focus on their home country more than others, just as a matter of where they're born and what they're taught to care about. But no, I think I agree with you completely. This is why I'm very critical of SocDems as well, because while it may well be true that Sweden and Norway and what have you were a lot better than America in a great many measurable ways, the fact remains that capitalists are always going to extract their resources from the places whence it costs the least to extract them, and that's, at least for now, always going to be in the developing world. And privately, personally, I kind of get the feeling that even in a post-scarcity society, even in a society where automation really can take care of all manufacturing and all industrial work, I still get the feeling that we're going to maintain that economic divide. I feel like there's something preferably exclusionary to the global North about keeping the global South in poverty. There's something socially requited there, like it's a component of our luxury. The knowledge that somewhere in Africa or Southeast Asia, there are people who can't find enough food to eat.
Exactly, and that's a very nice point to make. I mentioned something very similar in my video on unequal exchange that I have, where I mentioned that most likely the concepts of unequal exchange and value transference will continue to, at least in some meaningful sense, even under socialism. Suppose even in a fully socialist world, these sort of things will still exist and they would require to be combated. It would require the active, let's say, deindustrialization of many parts of the imperial core and the active industrialization. I was going to say reindustrialization because many of these parts of the third world have never been industrialized.
Right.
To equalize the level of productive capacity across them and to use the favorite of the to develop the productive forces, let's say, as a meme.
Nice
but yeah,
meme.
Yeah, but what I was gonna say, I was gonna just lead this into the idea of revolution.
Mhm.
I'm glad because you mentioned earlier that for the United States, you believe that, let's say, the revolution will emanate from the third world. It's not something that's going to happen in the US or Canada or France or the UK or wherever else.
I think. I think that's more likely, yeah, by a pretty wide margin.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah, by law of probabilities. Of course, we should never say never, quote, but just generally looking at the trends of how these things have developed, it's most likely not going to be Germany. It's most likely going to be either the Philippines or India or Peru or these sort of places that would have their revolutions. Now, in my personal conception, and this is why I wanted to talk about reform and revolution, not reform versus revolution, because with us, for example, here in Iraq, there is no reform that we can do. We do not have the capacity to imperialize other countries like the United States does, for example. We do not have this massive reserve of third world labor that we can draw on. We do not have capital-intensive firms that can invest and reinvest and extract profits from third world countries. This does not exist in Iraq. The only thing that is a possibility in this country is to work by our own efforts. That's not to say, of course, that the United States didn't develop, at least to some extent, by its own effort, of course. But when we bring that discussion in, then we have to bring in discussions of rates and so on.
We brought the global South working class to us with the transatlantic slave trade. So yeah,
basically, yeah, exactly. But my point is, in Iraq, for example, since we can't do this, we have to be like Vietnam or Cuba or all these other countries. We have to develop on our own stance, on our own positions, excuse me. And what this would mean is that there is no reforming, there's no social democracy that we can genuinely build up because the ruling classes would never allow their very cushy and very comfortable acquisition of our resources to go away in any meaningful sense. If we did do that in a social democratic, or let's just say democratically elected way, like Allende did in Chile, whoever is going to do this is going to end up dead, just like Salvador Allende did. So what this means, well, the only avenue that we would have available to us is for revolution. It is the forceful seizure of state power in Iraq, and then the nationalization of industry and collectivization of agriculture and the reorganization of the workplace along democratic lines, on and on. And suppression of markets, all this stuff. I think you're well aware of all this stuff. Now, this is very interesting because you mentioned it would be better to support third world countries. And this is my own perspective on the United States. And this is the advice I usually give to anybody who wants to hear my opinion on these sort of things. Americans that want to hear my opinion on these sort of things. It's this: the United States will not have a revolution. The best you can hope for in the US is lukewarm social democratic reforms. The best you can hope for is a bit of universal healthcare and maybe better employment guarantees and stuff like that. Not much more. So the best.
I just want to say it really bothers me because when I say that, people call me a liberal. But I agree. The problem, like America has is a surveillance state with the largest and strongest military industrial complex of any society in the history of the world, with a thoroughly brainwashed population coming off the back of 50 years of Red Scare. The idea of us being able to achieve a revolution here, I don't see it. But when I say stuff like that, people call me a liberal. Why do you get to get away with saying it?
It's because I'm brown, I think.
Yeah. Ooh. And anti-whiteness coming back against me again. No, I agree with you completely. America's future is at best lukewarm, and that's very optimistic. That's why I care so much about Bolivia, by the way. I was so when the Mass Party succeeded again, what was it, a month ago? I placed so much hopes in those people because I feel like that country is poised to do a lot of really wonderful stuff if left alone by America for a couple more decades, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's why I agreed with your point earlier. And that's why, to continue what I was saying before, it's to develop a working class movement that could succeed in reaching socialism in the US. You would ironically have to break those very things that cause the United States to be so wealthy and to be so secure and to be able to develop on its own terms like it has for the past 200 years. And what that would mean is to support third world revolutions and movements wherever possible, to support not only, let's say, the quote unquote, I don't want to say reformists, but the more social democrat, like you give the example of Bolivia, like to support those ones, but also to support movements that have picked up the gun, movements that are actively trying to militarily and violently seize the state apparatus and to lay their hands on the means of production by any means necessary, to use Malcolm X's terms. What this would mean is, for example, supporting the movement that is going on with the NPA in the Philippines. That's a perfect example of this. The reason I even mention this is, to quote Lenin, imperialism breaks at its weakest links. And the weakest link where a revolution is going to occur is not the United States or Germany, like we said. It's most likely the Philippines or Peru or India or all these places. Once revolution occurs there, the value chains are broken. The value transference that used to exist, this reserve of labor that could be drawn on to subsidize the living standards of this labor aristocracy we spoke of before, will be broken. And when that is broken, the ruling classes will have to reorient back to themselves. They're not going to say, oh, you know what, I guess we're just going to have to make do with less profits. They're never going to say this. So what they would do instead is they would reorient to the center, and they would increase the exploitation of their local populations, meaning, for example, American capitalists would reorient to the United States to further exploit their own working class like they used to 100, 120 years ago.
And then we established the material conditions for revolutionary action.
Beautiful. Exactly. I'm so glad that we see eye to eye on these things.
Yeah, I completely agree. We're in for, I think America is in for the roughest future of any of the global North countries, because we're going to be the last ones to fall. I mean, assuming things go quote unquote to plan, or go well, we see nation after nation in the global South. They unionize, they revolt, they nationalize their production, and hopefully America doesn't get involved. Hopefully we don't invade or install a puppet dictator or whatever. Assuming we do not, more and more of this supply chain gets blocked off, and eventually we either have sort of like a civic nationalist return to 1940s era, like local manufacturing, and everyone gets a fair wage, which is never going to happen for like 80 trillion economic reasons. Or yeah, like you say, we essentially just shift the focus and we turn a demographic within our own country into the global South. It's going to be Idaho, okay? We're going to take Idaho and everyone in there, okay? The slave shops will run from one corner of the state to the other, and only then will people be dispossessed enough to take any meaningful action. It's unfortunate, but a lot of people buy into this end of history bullshit where like every time America gets like some reform, every time Europe sees its like life expectancy increase, people clap their hands, they're like, oh, we're moving forward. But in reality, the gains of industrialization only reach so far. I mean, at a certain point, this obscene wealth is predicated on the back of, if not slavery, then something close. And our benefits are their losses because we exploit them. We deny them the ability to form meaningful economic relations within their own countries and their own blocks. And yeah, and then we get surprised when these countries never develop. I'm going to be really interested to see what happens in Africa over the next 30 years, the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm no fan of China, but I'm really hoping that I've heard like different reports of how well it's going. But if Africa could end up, if there could be like a Pan-African trading bloc like the EU, and they end up having like the global power to negotiate trade relations with the rest of the world rather than just being like the West's bitch, that would be amazing. That would do so much for, I don't know, the ability for global socialism to thrive. So maybe that can happen. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. And also we could mention the very fact that if that were to occur, the rate of industrialization that would occur in these countries would be slower, of course, because at the end of the day, the Western or the imperial core countries are already so highly industrialized that if revolution were to occur, then the building blocks that exist for, let's to use again the meme, the material conditions for revolution would align perfectly with the material conditions for economic development of socialism. So it's not like in the former. So like socialist examples like Soviet Union or China or where else you may think of, where it was a semi-feudal country that barely had any capitalist development, barely had any industry to speak of. Compare that to Germany or the United States or what have you. But this is interesting to note also, because I was going to say, now that we have agreed and we kind of see eye to eye on this, on the idea that yes, the support of third world movements, along with fighting for reforms at home to still nonetheless improve the conditions of the working class locally. What is to be done for, like, what is the material support that we can give? Because sometimes I meme on people and I say that when you say you critically support something, it doesn't, when somebody says they support this or that, it really doesn't matter because that's just you saying something. This support, if it doesn't actually meaningfully take some form that is material, then at the end it's, well, meaningless. And when we speak of revolution generally, how can we support these third world movements on a material basis? Now, I'm going to list a couple of things, and I want to hear your perspective as an American, because my perspective as an Iraqi might be a bit too, let's say, gung-ho about this sort of thing. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Yeah. So what I would say is fundamentally, the first and foremost is spreading information. I think that's the easiest and the cheapest thing to do because it costs nothing. Spreading correct information about these movements, talking about why they're doing what they're doing, what experience they have undergone, why their cause is just, if it is truly just, by the way. The NPA in the Philippines is a just cause. Let's say the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia was not a just cause. And I think these are things that we can appropriately analyze as Marxists or leftists and then reach a proper conclusion on. But so the first of the things I would mention would be this, like spreading of information. Secondary, which would be more material support, which would take the form of, for example, money and material goods of things they actually need. For example, radios is something very important. Communication devices, weapons, if you could even actually get it done. In the United States, I think this would be very difficult. Where I am, it's not. And then the fourth point, and this is the most important one, I think, for the United States, the development and the growth of anti-war movements. Nothing, in my opinion, is more important for the United States than the development of anti-war movements and attempts to stop every instance of particularly military aggression, but also the diplomatic isolation that they try to impose on these movements, along with the sanctioning of, if they were to actually conquer state power, sanctioning of these nations, so on and on. And then the final point, and this is the fifth one, this is the one that is the most difficult to kind of sell to Americans, because I understandably this would harm them directly, that is the sabotage of the American military industry. And the best example of this would be what the Red Army faction, it did in West Germany. Which what they would do, if you're unaware, is they would sabotage NATO bases. They would cause either they would disrupt ammunition production, or they would outright steal weaponry from the depots on. Whatever other creative things the American people could come up with. Would you agree generally with this 5 points on how to materially support third world movements?
Yeah, I think, I don't disagree with any of those points, I don't think. I think, in fact, I'd add to that. I think so realistically speaking, in America right now, there's no real way to disrupt the production of any like militaristic resources because, well, I guess it's possible, but I feel like people get arrested real quick, and not be able to do much harm. But I agree principally. If there's anything we could do to sabotage those forces, I would agree with it. Yeah, it's just a matter of like how to practically get it done. What I think would actually be really, really important is if we could form international workers, I guess, aid missions. Imagine, for example, in Iraq, Rojava, in Bolivia, we have a couple hundred Americans who are there for humanitarian work, and they're doing so explicitly under the wing of like perhaps the most left-leaning parliamentary group. Like they're vaguely associated. If you get those people there, the likelihood of any like militaristic action being taken against that country drops massively, because even though Americans are very willing to kill Bolivians, we are not willing to kill other Americans. That is way, way, way harder in the domestic press. So if like we feel as though there are countries around the world that are fomenting this meaningful socialist advocacy, I think sending people over, not just to be effective hostages, but to work there and to, provide what they can, would go a long way towards preventing anything bad happening in the future. I think that's something, didn't we used to do that? I'm sorry, my brain is frying a little bit right now, but I know that it's been a long-held tradition of anti-war organizations to send people to the areas they don't want America to mess around in. But I'd have to look in my history book to remind myself of the specifics there.
No, for sure, we had some of them in Iraq.
Yeah, I think that would generally be preferable because, again, America, like I'm sure you know the memes, right? Western media, you're Iraqi. If 100 of you die in some drone strike, that's like page 8 news. If a single American missionary gets like a splinter while on tour, in Baghdad, that's front page news. So as long as Americans are racist, we can exploit that,
I'm glad it's interesting that you add that point, yeah. And this would be developed, of course, according to the discussions that would be taken by American comrades and what they personally consider to be the best approach. And by the way, when I said like sabotage and whatnot, of course, it's given that the movement is sufficiently mature. I'm not saying like people go right now and try to, blow up Fort Knox or whatever. I don't know. Is Fort Knox for military purposes? I just know
Fort Knox, where we keep our gold, I believe. Okay. That was the plot of a James Bond movie, so it would still be suitably spectacular. One other thing, by the way, I just want to say, I do think that we could do way more with regard to foreign aid. America is obscenely wealthy. I think 0.3% of our budget goes to foreign aid. If we could, if we had a parliamentary group, like a left-leaning third party, that would withhold votes on progressive legislation unless they could earmark foreign aid to developing socialist countries, I think that'd be pretty sick too. Because you could get, for a fraction of our global congressional budget, we could get an unfathomable amount of money going to these countries. Obviously, you have some issues there because that's being done through the state apparatus, and the state apparatus, unless America's socialist, will always be antagonistic to these countries. But I think there are probably ways to do that in a beneficial manner,
At least in an unofficial form, if not outright officially. Yeah,
whatever can be done.
Yeah, and that's very interesting to note. Now, here's the crux of the matter, and kind of one of my main questions for you, actually. I would like to get your perspective on the formation of working class organizations that start this community organizing and the development of mutual aid groups and all these sort of things, along with some sort of working class group and this caucus building and whatever else electoral participation that we could get done immediately. Like this is stuff that could be started from tomorrow. You can actively be working towards this. What for you as an American and somebody who's on the left, what do you think the timeline for these things are? What do you think takes the greatest, let's say, what's the English word? Precedence, I believe. What is the thing that should be done first, and then subsequently when it comes to this overall strategy that we discussed?
And I don't know. I feel like our country is so cucked. Like, I think something like 50% of people who are renting houses right now are facing eviction because they can't put up for rent because we didn't get any aid from the government for nearly a year. We're like so cucked. Americans hate protesting their government. They despise it so much. So I can't imagine. I'm trying to think like what the realistic time frame is here. Like, because when I imagine like American working class organizations organically developing, I imagine it in the context of like climate change ravages Florida because the sea levels rise and people have to band together. Something truly apocalyptic has to happen. I'm trying to think, man. Honestly, I know this sounds super lib-cucked or whatever. I really feel like the only way to do this presently is through some kind of indirect affiliation with like the Justice Dems or some kind of progressive caucus. That's not because I want that. I don't want that. I just feel like that's legitimately the only apparatus capable of mobilizing enough people to get work together like that. Black Lives Matter has done, I mean, let's be real. Black Lives Matter hasn't accomplished very much apart from getting a lot of people out there on the street. The organization is kind of sort of affiliated with the Democratic Party, not like super duper so, but somewhat. And they were able to get out there because George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I mean, we can't just keep waiting for black people to get killed unjustly by the police to motivate people to go outside. And even if they do, that doesn't necessarily lead to anything. I don't know. That's a really, really difficult question. I think one of the reasons why I focus on the electoral element of working class organization so much is because America is so bad at like moving outside of that circle. All of our presidential election cycles last 2 years. They begin 2 years before election day. We start talking about the next candidates. It's a perpetual spectacle that everybody gets involved in. It feels like an impetus for people to foment their political views in a way they can't in other aspects of society, because the rest of American society is kept very deliberately apolitical, or at least it maintains the illusion of apoliticality. Obviously, when you're walking, to your job at Amazon and you get a little like employee module about how you don't need a union and you'd rather spend your money on a video game or something, obviously this is political, but the way our society is designed is meant to supplant those thoughts to the greatest possible extent. And it's so difficult to get people mobilized. And maybe I'm just doom ranting right now. I'm sorry.
It's fine. No, I completely understand. I share the, let's say, I don't want to say the pessimism, but I understand why you can be so pessimistic about the United States. Because personally, like, I don't know if you know this, but Iraq currently is in flames. We have protests going on now. At any given moment, we have protests going on. And when I read about the the $600 stimulus check, 600.
We debated over that for 3 months. For 3 months, we debated over that $600.
Yeah, when I heard this, and I was like, that doesn't, to my knowledge, that doesn't even cover like rent for most people. For the vast majority of people, that doesn't even cover rent. And so I can and people didn't go out. People didn't go out. And if something of that magnitude happened in Iraq, blood spills already. But yeah, what I'm saying is that
even the French love protesting. They're yellow vest protests. They all the time. They love it. They're way better at it than we are. Americans are terrible at civil disobedience.
Exactly. So I completely understand this point. And this brings me to something interesting that I also want to discuss. When having this conversation, of course, like I originally thought, and I think you thought too, we do genuinely actually agree on way more things than we disagree on. And that's why I wonder, this is how I can put it. To me, for example, just to give you background on myself, I've been part of the left. I've considered myself a Marxist-Leninist for almost a decade at this point. Mm-hmm. And overall this time, I've done a lot of reading personally to try to develop these ideas and try to get different perspectives and try to talk to as many people as I could. You, on the other hand, from my personal understanding, is that you did similar to what I did, but I believe your emphasis is more on lived experience and actually discussing with people, even though you've also read, to an extent, you've also read literature on the topic. This is what I would like to call almost like an organic consciousness or an organic socialism that has developed, because your positions and perspectives are rational, they make sense, and they align with that which is empirical reality. When you read, not to again bring the meme, but when you read the theory, and when I say theory, I don't always mean like what Lenin and Marx wrote. I mean also works that were written last year. For example, the book I mentioned earlier, Zach Cope's World Divided Class, was published in 2019, I believe. Suwandi's book, Value Chains, which is also on the stratification of labor, that was published also in 2018 or 2019, on. But this is why this is what's interesting, because you have developed, from my understanding, your positions are you've organically reached correct positions. But also reading theory can also aid in this. And my question to you is, I'm not going to say, why don't you like theory? No, I'm not going to say, because that's probably a mischaracterization of what you believe. What is your perspective on theory? That's what I want to ask you.
I think that reading theory is incredibly helpful. I know that from what I've read, there are a lot of really important insights in there. Obviously, theory to socialists isn't like medical text to a doctor. There's a degree of empiricism to like a hard science that isn't the case when we're reading about, I mean, let's be real about what we're reading about. We're reading political theory that was usually independently developed from like some very intelligent white guys so and so long ago. And of course, nowadays, we read more theory from people of color and from women and what have you. But generally speaking, that's what we think of when we talk about theory. That doesn't make it wrong, of course. And in fact, any Marxist should believe, I would hope any Marxist would believe, that all theory should be read in the context of the material conditions of its time. A lot of what Marx wrote is still very insightful today. A lot of what he wrote makes sense only in the context of a 19th century industrial society. Obviously, the world we live in today is very, very different. Incomprehensible, in fact, to the men whose writings we occasionally read. My issue with theory isn't that theory is bad. Certainly not. My issue with theory is that there were a lot of people online who treat it the way religious fundamentalists treat the Bible. They don't actually engage with the arguments. They don't actually think about what's being said. They don't relate to the argumentation or the discourse. Instead, they just cite the text. They recant out these these memorized sections, and I think it's very frustrating because a theory on its own is meaningless without the critical ability to engage and analyze what it is you're reading. They would have agreed with me on that. Marx, what have you. Like, text on its own is worthless without critical engagement. And we know that because you can be a conservative and read Das Kapital and come away a conservative. So obviously the text on its own is not the entirety of the picture. I just think a lot of people use it to engage in bad faith. I don't mean to come off cross, but your fans have been incessantly aggressive towards me, both now in the YouTube chat, where they've been calling me a liberal and a pedophile and what have you, but just generally speaking in Twitter and in basically every medium through which they're capable of communicating with me. And I know that my fans, despite my fan base being proportionally larger, haven't engaged in that reciprocal attention. And it's a little bit frustrating because I feel like, as is evidenced by this conversation, a reasonable convo between reasonably intelligent people who are both leftists, I think should always end in agreement. I would hope so. I think that we have so much to agree on, and so much of the negative discourse is based on either a misinterpretation of one's belief or like a uncharitable take, or maybe somebody said something dumb in passing and that ends up getting blown out of proportion and that ends up being a representative of what they believe, so on and so forth. I'll say this, because I know I'm rambling. I'll say this to end. What got me into being a leftist properly, or at least what got me onto the idea, were the writings of Emil Durkheim, who's a sociologist, and he wrote on criminality being a necessary component of a functioning society. Criminality is a flashpoint that allows us to examine antagonisms between human desire and human order. So why is there so much starvation or theft in this area? Well, are people starving? What's being stolen? Is it food? Criminality can help us understand where there are faults in society. And when you think about society that way, all of these petty individual crimes and failings can be summed up into class antagonism. And I arrived at the idea of class antagonism before reading anything about it directly because it made sense as a product of what Durkheim had wrote. Now, Durkheim's never cited in like leftist discourse because he wasn't a leftist. But I would encourage people to be open to the idea that it's very possible to arrive at these conclusions, to arrive at these beliefs in non-hegemonic ways, in unorthodox ways, and that those ways are just as valid as reading a bunch of Lenin and then, coming to the conclusions that you do.
Yeah, and I appreciate that perspective. And I personally would, just as a side note about people who have written to you, I hope you do understand that as most likely just a vocal minority.
Oh, yeah.
And the people who have written to you who have been very negative, well, I'd much rather if they had not. So if you people are in the chat, please don't do that.
It's a biased result too, because I'm a very contentious person on the left, so there are always going to be people who are anti-me. But I understand that. I don't hold you personally accountable for that sort of thing.
Yeah, nor do I hold you accountable for, of course, a small but vocal minority of your audience that had done similar things. But I'm just overlooking them because I know that you're not actually sending them my way for that purpose. But
not that you know.
But yeah, my point is that I agree with you. Made a very good point, which you said, and I liked how you worded it too. You said that you can reach these positions in non-hegemonic ways. I'm assuming you don't mean hegemonic in the Gramscian sense, but more of a, let's say, outside what is normally considered to be the standard road down the
hegemony of leftist Twitter discourse. A very small hegemony, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like the way that you worded it and the very fact that you stated that, because I personally agree with that, because my approach to leftism was also not in a way that would standardly, I did not have parents that were in a communist party. They were in a left party. They were not in a communist party, though. I did not have a much engagement with these texts until I discovered what socialism was, and then decided to start reading for myself, on and on. And it's incredibly important to not be, I don't want to use the word elitist, but I think that actually does work. Not to be elitist about this literature, because the point of it is to grow your understanding. It is not a dogma, right? Mao has a lovely little work. It's a very short work that he wrote, which is simply called "Avoid Book Worship," and you can pretty much get the gist of what he's trying to say from that title. But I do recommend people go and read it. But the general,
who else said that? Pol Pot.
Yeah, but I mean, Pol Pot was the only one who managed to establish communism. So that's a joke, people. In case anybody takes me seriously, that's a joke. Just because he burned the central bank doesn't mean that Of course, you
do you wear glasses? Would you survive? No, wait, you're a doctor. There's no way. There's no way you'd survive.
Exactly right. No, but I was gonna say, yeah, of course he abolished the commodity form. There were no commodities being produced. But yeah, but generally what I was saying is that, yeah, I completely agree with that idea. And we should not be elitist about this literature. We should not mindlessly regurgitate it. We should actively engage with it and try to apply it to our current conditions. And also, this is something that I see. It's hard enough to get people to read the very basic texts of our tradition, of our combined tradition of leftism, both yours and mine. It's difficult enough to get people to read just even like Wage, Labor, and Capital, like very simple, short pamphlets of Marx. It's very difficult to get people even to read the basics of Lenin and Mao. Mm-hmm. It's, I think, even another level of difficulty to get people to learn these or study them, to gain the perspectives of them, and then move on to more modern literature that builds off of that. What I mean is, for example, if we talk about, again, like I mentioned, a couple of works, and there's a reason I'm harping a lot about the concept of labor aristocracy, is because it is of crucial importance to American comrades, to people, members of the Imperial Corps and the working classes that exist there, because it is their own lived experience, even though they may not realize it. So even when I discuss, for example, the works of Zach Cope, even when I discuss the works of Emmanuel Arguiri, of Swandi, like I mentioned earlier, of Samir Amin, all these people, they build up off of concepts that were developed, for example, in Marx's Capital, at least the third volume in particular. They build up off of the concepts of Lenin, particularly the concept of labor aristocracy was solidified by Lenin, on and on. And this is my personal recommendation. I think this kind of got lost in the, is it called the telephone game? I don't know what it's called in English.
Yes.
Yeah, the he said, she said, that stuff. Yeah. I am not a theory absolutist. You are not a theory denier. Both of us understand the very important nature of them, and we both came to the same conclusion, that is, we should approach them as academic. We should approach them in an academic way to try to understand their perspectives and to apply them to our current conditions. They should not be a dogma that is just simply applied in order to make yourself feel superior to others. And that's just kind of my point. And my recommendation, particularly to your audience, is if you have the chance and you feel like comfortable enough to engage with some theory, it doesn't have to be just, whatever it can be, then do actively engage with it, because I think whatever presuppositions many people may have about theory, meaning like Lenin's work or Marx's work or Mao's work, they're going to find to be completely dashed when they actually get to the work, because they're going to see, wow, they actually are saying very, I don't want to say deep things. Say my English is failing me right now.
It is. It is deep. It's not. Yeah, no, substantive. Yeah, informed. You won't find
exactly
any
informed.
You won't find any disagreement in my chat. I have encouraged them to read theory. Well, I'll open up to you. Okay. The whole. I'm sure you've probably seen discourse on it. I say like I hate theory, or I've said that I've read all theory, and it oscillates between the two. The reality is, I just have unmedicated ADHD, so I'm not great at reading, and even following audiobooks is pretty tiring. The times that I do get off, I guess, well, I'm not getting off my ass. I actually sit down to read, but the times that I do read theory, I've found it incredibly insightful. I hope that my audience would partake in that same thing. But I agree with you. The ultimate argument that I'd make is this, and I guess this is following through on what I learned from sociology. Even if you have texts which affirm your position, you should always be able to make the argument on your own. Because otherwise you are engaging in a sort of dogmatism there. It's the same way with identity politics, For example, I've argued with people on this channel. Sometimes they're like they're black and conservative, like a black conservative. And I'll try to argue with them on race relations and how Trump is a racist or how conservative positions further racism, and they are very defensive. And what's more, they'll use their identity as a shield, like, oh, I'm black, these are my experiences. And while I argue that being black can inform your position on race relations, that's totally valid, you still have to be able to make the argument on your own. And likewise with theory, it's great if you can cite a passage, and that can inform your understanding. But if you understand it so damn well, you should be able to make the argument, right? And as long as people can do that, I think they're doing fantastic. I think they're doing great.
I agree. Yeah. To put that a bit in a more clear way, maybe for some people, I think it's what you're saying is a practical understanding of what is being said and the analysis being made is far superior to a mechanical regurgitation of what you read.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And I more than fully agree with this. And I do personally think that this is a issue. And this is actually an important distinction I guess we can make on the online left, because in my personal experience with the people I've organized with in real life, I have never seen these issues. Very rarely have I met people who don't actively, people in committed working class groups or, with community organizing and stuff like that. I've never met, or very rarely have I met people who did not have a very, developed understanding based not only in these texts, but also in their practical experience and their practical understanding and their own, not to use the word enlightened, but analysis of, like, they reflected on what they read and then applied it appropriately in their understanding. And that's why this is something that does exist as an issue on the very vocal group that is the online left, which both you and I are part of since we engage with YouTube and whatnot. But yeah, I completely, more than 100% agree. Just this, I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, do you feel that there's an issue with lefties who are aesthetics oriented? Like left-leaning people who don't seem to be very interested in the principles of workers' liberation or of like collective organization or of the decommodification of markets, but rather they seem to really like, like the Soviet Union or Stalin or they're really into like the, what is it, like the USSR anthem or something like that. Like, because I noticed this a lot. These people turned me off the left back when I was in high school. Is this like something that you notice a lot, or do you think it's blown out of proportion largely?
Personally, just a side note, you said decommodification of markets. You mean just generally decommodification, I believe. The thing that you mentioned, I think it's been it's a bit of both. It has been blown out of proportion because in my real life experience, I have not seen this that much. And on the online left too, and I'm part of Marxist-Leninist spaces, I see it rarely. But there is, again, the bringing back to the vocal minority, there is a group of people that care too much about the aesthetics. And this is the thing. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a guy named Umberto Eco. He wrote a very short work titled Ur-Fascism.
I'm a big fan.
Now, oh, really? Fantastic. But basically, just to give a general gist for people who are unaware, he discusses in his other work as well, not just particularly this one, what he calls the power of the aesthetic for fascism. He discusses how fascism not only is about aesthetics, but also that very aesthetic that it tries to reproduce is what causes people to gravitate towards it. This idea of order and organization and the hierarchical structures that are very well maintained. Everything is like a highly, functioning, highly efficient, well-greased machine, that kind of perspective. It's, if you notice, it's always the very neatly marching soldiers, and all the uniforms are very slick and all that. You understand.
And of course, in reality, these societies are very poorly organized.
Exactly.
Yeah, Nazi Germany was like a bureaucratic shithole where the leaders were degenerates by their own mark, and their military campaigns were poorly organized. But it's the aesthetic. Exactly. It's about getting people to feel that way. I'm very, very critical of aesthetic purity, especially in left-leaning circles, and I'm reminded of it because I know, for example, that there are a lot of people. I'm not trying to impugn your community, whatever, but there are a lot of people who I would call tankies, and they make fun of me. They're like, well, why don't you go out there and organize? Like, when was the last time you engaged in a collective action? Which, in addition to being a very dumb question, I have a very large channel. I mean, I can obviously sway minds. We all take the jobs we're best for, to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities. But it seems to me with an obsession over what the aesthetic of a leftist advocate is, not so much what can you do with the platform you have, in which case the answer would be keep making videos, but more what should a lefty advocate look like? When I imagine one, what do they look like in my head? It's something that worries me because while aesthetics may be the selling point of fascism, it will be the death of leftism because we can't rely on it the same way they can. It's not our crutch. And I don't want meaningful advocacy to be supplanted or disregarded because it's operating outside, I don't know, the stereotypical image of like the Bolshevik soldier or the Black Panther Party member. I get a lot of that online. I think a lot of people don't really know how to move forward, so they stick to images and sound bites they're familiar with, and those may be comforting, but I don't know how much those are going to sell us down the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually a very interesting point. Just because you mentioned the degeneracy of fascism. I don't like to use the word degeneracy because it is a fascist term most of the time, but right, I know what you mean.
Using their own mirror,
Exactly, perfect. Yeah. There's a very interesting book called Blitzed, which talks about basically the rampant drug abuse of the leadership, the Nazi leadership. So if people are interested, they should check that out. But yeah, when you mention exactly what the idea. Bringing it back to the idea of the aesthetic, we have people like this on the left as well. And these people are problematic not because they like the aesthetics. Some of the aesthetics are very cool, undoubtedly. But it's also like equally, fascism is disgusting in all its regards. But when you strip all of fascism's, like you strip everything that makes fascism, and you look at just, for example, the uniform of an SS officer, you can aesthetically say that it is a nicely designed uniform, right? That's what that idea of just appreciating the aesthetic damages, like you mentioned, damages the left more than it helps it. And the fact that there is a presence of these people signals an issue of communication on our part. I get what I'm trying to say is there are people who get into leftist aesthetics before they get into leftist politics. Right. And I know there are people who have appreciated leftist aesthetics or Soviet aesthetics, let's say, or what have you. And then they begin to read about like socialism and whatnot. And then they migrate into a position of actually being a leftist. And when
there's certainly people like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And when this jump from appreciating aesthetics to actively being a well-informed socialist that understands that okay, the aesthetics may be cool, but it's not exactly the best way to portray ourselves, because those aesthetics come with a lot of baggage. And even if a lot of that baggage is wildly incorrect, most people don't know that. So it's better to, when this jump, this shift fails from the aesthetic to active political understanding and participation, of actually being a leftist and reading the work and all that, that is also an error on our part, I think, of reaching these people. But I do agree with you that
I think I agree with that. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and there does exist a small group of these people that kind of just are very loud about liking their Ushankas and blasting the Soviet anthem. Which
that's why I make a deliberate effort. I don't have any lefty aesthetics anywhere in any of my media. My background is just art, like anime stuff from Anime Expo and stuff. I wish people could know, or I want people to know, like, you can be a leftist, you can believe these things. It's not a lifestyle, it's not an aesthetic. It's just a set of political, social, moral, and economic principles. But you can be a redneck and be a socialist, you know? You can be a weeb and be a socialist. I feel like the more free form we are with our aesthetic preferences, the more likely we are to attract a broad base. That's kind of the joke I made. Have you seen anyone say super capitalism anytime in the past 72 hours?
No, I have not.
That's good. I made it.
I said I was working the entire time. So
that's good. No, that's good. So I'll ask you then, because this is what I was trying to test. Say you're an American, because let's just talk about America. And you're in America. Let's say that you could sell every single American on socialism, from government down, and but it's not called socialism. You call it super capitalism, and by twisting the definition of capitalism and like, well, you like private ownership so much, everyone gets private ownership now, you know, by twisting it to the point where you're actually extolling socialism using capitalist aesthetics, you actually get a socialist society that calls itself capitalist. I think that would be fantastic, because I don't care about the aesthetics at all. Even if we could delude the population of this country into tricking themselves into being socialist, no matter what you have to do it, as long as you're not lying to them on like the actual things you're advocating for, I think that's lovely. I'm very flexible, I guess, with means or methods, which is why it frustrates me so much. It seems like some people are very, very, very orthodox with how they approach like engagement. You said you believe that the dichotomy between reform and revolution is silly and exclusionary, and I agree completely. There are a lot of people online who believe only one of those things is valid. People who think that only revolution is good and that all reform is like conciliatory, I think that's very dumb and short-sighted. And people who think that only reform is worthwhile, I mean, we call them soakdems, don't we? So it's the synthesis between these two things and the aesthetics that work that allow us to make meaningful change. And that's what I'd like to focus on most, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. So just the general, I guess, summation of that point is, yes, aesthetics can be useful, but you shouldn't overdo it, and you shouldn't take baggage from other sorts of, well, aesthetics. And also, the point you made about, to call it super capitalism, as funny as that is, although I understand the sentiment, I also do understand that just generally, at least from my personal experience with Americans who are not socialists, I think anything that may be loosely lefty, even if you call it super capitalism, they're going to start calling you a communist. But I understand the sentiment generally, and I do agree with it. And the final point being that just generally, when approaching leftism as a whole, you should never take it as a dogma. And that even though generally we understand that, both you and I understand that reformism generally, for the most part, is a dead end usually, especially in the imperial core countries. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have its uses depending on material conditions. And we can also see that revolution, for example, in the imperial core countries is a dead end because it's not feasible as it currently stands. While in third world countries, it makes far more sense to advocate for revolution than to advocate for petty, lukewarm social democratic reforms. On and on. And the point, to wrap that all up, is it depends on the material conditions. Even with putting that meme aside, it always depends on the material conditions. And that's why we require a proper analysis of said material conditions. And that's why we also require a proper understanding of the factors that have led to whatever thing we're analyzing. We should have a proper understanding of the literature on the topic, and both modern and old, and also have a proper practical understanding and application of said literature and factors that have come before us. to come to an appropriate conclusion. And that's actually the point about your thing, and this is about the video and the responses that we had and on and on. And it's that, me personally, in the end, I don't think it is fair of me to comment on Democrats or Republicans or who to vote for what or what to do in the United States. Generally, I can only comment, well, generally, because I do not have lived experience of an American, nor do I know the intricacies of what being an American is, what the American mindset is, how Americans approach different issues, how they view their own politics and their own communities and the social relations between them, on and on. So, and I mentioned this in the video, I personally believe that whatever educated and principled leftists in the United States, upon proper discussion and democratic consensus, whatever decision they come to, is a decision that can be, well, analyzed and criticized, but in the end, in a almost democratic centralist sort of way, can be supported, because it is what they have come to decide is the correct course of action. Of course, this requires working class organizations and a proper discussion, but you are one cog in that much larger machine that I hope that will continue to develop over the next coming years and decades of American leftism.
Absolutely. 1 million subs, baby. 2022. We're getting it. No, yeah, I agree completely. I honestly, oh God, I feel like 90% of intra-left infighting is a person makes one point and the other person makes a separate point, and both groups assume the other person doesn't have anything else to say about it, and they extrapolate the worst conceivable sort of I don't know, associative points. No, I really appreciate you coming on to speak with me. I really do. I'm glad the conversation was amicable. I am
For sure
not especially optimistic about the future of the United States of America, so hopefully the Global South can pick up a little bit of slack so I can have something to look forward to over the coming years. And just as a forewarning, in 2024, you will be getting my Marx and Lenin would have wanted you to vote for Kamala Harris video. So just get ready for that one.
Oh, Lord. It's okay. We can continue the game until then.
It hurts to say. Seriously, mate, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for letting the conversation just flow as it is.
Yeah, shout yourself out.
And thank you for being such a lovely host. Oh, yeah. Sure, yeah. Well, I have a channel named Hakim, or yeah, well, I just Hakim. And my Twitter is at yeahboy Hakim, because, you know,
because you're
I
your
don't
boy.
understand why I made it that, but hey. Anyway, exactly, I'm your boy. And of course, if you have any questions for me, again, to reiterate, I couldn't see the chat. So if you have any questions for me and I didn't get to them or what have you, please feel free to DM me on Twitter. And yeah, thanks for the lovely discussion, fam.
Have a wonderful day. It's like 1 a.m. over there, isn't it?
Yes, and I'm on call, and I have a night shift in like 3 hours. So.
Okay, go. Thank you and be well.
All right. Go. Yeah, take care. Good night, fam.
Take care. I should have taken up betting odds because I'd be willing to bet that most of you wouldn't have thought that would have gone so well. Okay, that went super well. Good. Gotta wait. The real anger will be the 2024 Kamala Harris Lenin Marx video. All right, listen up. If you watch that and you're chilling over here right now, you should subscribe to my channel. Okay, you should subscribe because hey, look at that. I'm not a rad lib or whatever. No, sub if you want to. I had a lot of fun with the conversation. It was very good. It was very, very good. No, by sub I mean to my channel, I don't mean sub to my account. Okay. I care about the money. I care about the YouTube subs. I do care about the money.